Have you ever tried to get a golden hour color grade in your photo, but you've struggled to pull it off? Well, most likely you've either tried to push your yellow and orange sliders in hopes that whatever color was coming in from the sun, that would create the look that you wanted, or you've tried to push your temperature slider warmer so that you could get those golden tones, but it never really looked the way that you wanted it to. Well, there's a really fast and easy way that I've been able to create this golden hour color grade while keeping my image looking more cinematic, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. Let's jump into Lightroom and I'll show you step by step of how you can create a color grade like this for your own photos. Okay, so I've got my shot here that I'm going to be working with, and I've already dialed in my lighting and my color mixer tab, so making sure that all the HSL is adjusted. There's a few points that I want to make on that before we get into color grading, but I just want to let you know ahead of time that we've already got this image set up and we're just going to go straight into color grading. So a couple of things that I want to mention here that I think would be really helpful and beneficial to you as you go through the editing process is, first, when we come to the tone curve tab and we look at the top of the tone curve, you can see that instead of being pulled up like this, it's actually brought down. And what that does is it actually crushes these brightest highlights, which is under my rider's arm. So when we come to a shot like this, for example, you can see that this actually helps a whole lot more. Now, if we bring this up, you can see we're losing a lot of our color and a lot of our tone actually in these highlights that are being blown out. So if you want to recover a lot of those highlights and allow those highlights to actually push into your initial color grade, what you can do, and a quick hack that you can do, is you can actually pull down on the top of this curve here, and you don't want to go too far, because you go too far and that completely crushes and ruins the highlights in your photo, which you don't want. So I'd recommend to put this point somewhere between the top here and this highlight point, right somewhere in the middle, and you'll get a really great look every single time. So now when we go back to our photo here, we're going to start with our color grading tab, and this is usually the way that I like to break this down. So I'll start with the globals first if I really want to push a super aggressive look, and then I'll go with the highlights, then the midtones, then the shadows. And I'll usually go in that sequence because usually, most times for most photos, the highlights are actually going to be affecting the most, and if not the highlights, then the midtones. So I like to go in that process just to see what is affecting my photo. And if it is a super low light photo, then obviously the shadows are going to be affecting the most, and the highlights probably not so much. But the globals are a great place to start if you want to push a really aggressive look. So now let's start in the globals here and start pushing in a tone. Now the color that I'm choosing for my globals is going to be based off of what's already in my scene, and all that's being set up within the color mixer tab. So if you're not really sure exactly what you want to push, I would just start pushing in a look here, and you can see that because I had this set up beforehand, this obviously works well with my shot. Now if we were to move this to the right, okay, that's too red. That doesn't look natural. If we move to the left, okay, those greens aren't really natural to what you'd see in a normal environment. So once we start bringing that back, somewhere right in here, that is looking more natural. It's not too red and it's not too yellow. So that's a great place to start. And then from this point, what I'll do is start dialing my saturation based off of how aggressive I want this look to be. So I'm just going to pull this back a bit here, because I can always bring this up later after I go through the highlight, midtone, shadow process. I can always add more color later if I want to go super aggressive. So I'm just going to dial it back to around like 59. And now for the highlight point, this is actually going to be pushing in the same tone as my globals. Now this isn't always going to be the case, but I would say for probably 90% of the grades that I create, this is going to be the case. So I'm going to push in the same tone up into like that yellowy orange. And for this, in the highlights, like I could go a bit of a shade off to the left or to the right, just depending on the certain shot. Like if I want to, I could pull this a little bit more red. Okay, like that's highlighting some of this sun tone, maybe giving it a little bit more of like that burnt orange look. But for this shot in particular, I'm just gonna bring that back more on the yellowy side, just because that's kind of where I really like this look to sit. And then for the midtones are actually gonna follow after the highlights as well. So I'm going to push in, and so I can really dial up. I would say try and not push too far with your midtones, because once we push too far, then sometimes what can happen is there can be a bit of fraying. This image isn't so bad, but there can be some fraying between the midtones and the highlights, because if the highlights aren't super pushed and the midtones are really pushed, what can happen is that section looks very saturated, and we don't want that to distract from the overall image. But as for this shot, this actually looks pretty cool. So I could bump this up a lot, or maybe I might just dial it back just a hair. So I'll go like 66. All right, and you can see just how fast and just how easy we were able to create this look already. Super fast, super dialed in. So now let's look at our shadows. So when I go to the shadow wheel here, I'm just gonna punch in on my image, and it's very hard to see, but there's actually some bleeding that's coming into the deep shadows from the midtones. And so when I turn the eye off on the midtones, and you look at the blacks here, you're gonna see a little bit of that orange tone fading into the blacks. So I'm gonna turn this off and on. Now my objective here is to balance out the blacks so that they get neutral blacks. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to push the opposite tone of my highlights and the opposite tone of my midtones. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to start pushing in a little bit of this tone. Now this is obviously too much, and sometimes it's hard to notice, sometimes it's hard to tell. So what we need to do is we need to turn the eye off and then turn it back on. And yeah, we can see that this is just too aggressive. So let's pull this back here. Let's go super subtle, because most times you don't have to push too far with the shadow wheel, but sometimes you do need to. So let's turn this off and back on. A little bit too much even still. So I'm gonna go at about 5. Let's see. Off and on. Maybe bump it up to 7. Off, and then on. Okay. I feel like my blacks are neutral now, and let's just turn this off as a whole and turn this on. Now we've got this really, really cool golden hour look. And so from this point here, I feel like we achieved our look. Now let's go into another shot in a completely different environment. This was definitely golden hour. So some might say, okay, yeah, that's a really easy one to pull off. It's golden hour. All right, let's go to something a little bit more challenging. So let's go to the same shoot. If you're stuck wondering how to level up your color grades so that your photos can look like the top industry professionals so that you can start charging more for your work, I've created a solution just for you called Color Grade Like a Pro. Color grading is so much more than pushing sliders or wheels. It's about understanding how color theory, emotion, lighting, and storytelling all affect your photos. That's why in this program, I'm uncovering the exact process and systems that all professional photographers use to edit their photos. And for a limited time, I'm also adding in my top 24 presets that I use on every single project. So if you're looking for your work to stand out amongst all the different photographers, you can find more information in the description below. All right, let's get back to the video. Now for this shot, this was more on the tail end of midday, and so obviously we're not going to get as many of like those golden hour tones. This is more harsh lighting, so we're not naturally going to get those golden tones. So I feel like this is going to be a really great one to show exactly how this process works, even for this shot. So let's even go into the tone curve tab here, and you can see here that I pulled down really aggressive on these really bright highlights. Now I could always pull down even more on these highlights up in the sky here, pull down a little bit on these midtones. I don't want to get rid of too much contrast, but obviously this image was a little bit overexposed, and that's okay. I just want to keep more of my shadow detail, and so this is gonna also, I think, help enhance the look. So I feel like this is a great point for the tone curve. So now let's go into the same process that we just followed. So with my globals here, I really want to push this look aggressively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push in that yellowy tone. Okay, now I don't want to go too much, because if I go too much, then it's really polluting the whole image as a whole. So what I'm going to do is just pull that back a little bit. All right, somewhere in here where it feels more natural. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the highlights here. And what I'm going to do is push these in here. Now I can go really as aggressive as I want. I can push in super heavy if I want that really nostalgic feeling vintage vibe. I think this is a really cool look, but it's totally your preference. So we could dial that back even a little bit. I want it more higher, so I'm going to go to about 80. Now let's push in the midtones here. Now the midtones are really going to add to that. Now I don't really like how the midtones are giving this yellow to the dirt, so I'm actually just going to push those a little bit more on the orange side here. And it's okay to do this sometimes if you need to. And so let's turn this off and on. I like to do that throughout the process just to see how it's affecting my photo. Now I don't want to go too saturated, because I don't want to pollute the entire image. Okay, so now when we come to the shadows, we need to balance out our blacks. We're going to do what I had mentioned before, and we're going to actually push the opposite way of our highlights, midtones. And so now once we start pushing in some saturation, this is a little bit too much for the blue. Let's turn the eye off and on. Now instead of it looking too polluted with reds, it's looking a little bit polluted with blue. So let's just pull that back. Okay, so from this point it looks okay. Turn that off and on. A little bit too blue even still. So let's go to about 14. Off and on. Okay, now those blacks are looking a lot more neutral, and when I come out, even into the grass over here, this is looking more natural green as it would in real life. So this is a great place to be. So now let's turn the eye off as a whole, and let's turn this on. Okay, so now we have this really nice golden glow, and this looks super dialed, super mint for this entire look, for this entire grade. And I actually created this grade for this entire look, and this is one of the looks that are actually in my preset pack. So if you are interested in looking more into the types of presets that I have, then you can always find that in the description below. All right, and just like that, we have our golden hour color grade. Now, if you like this video, let me know what resonated with you in the comments below. And if you want to continue to level up your color grading journey, then I think you'll really like this video. I'll see you over there. Peace.